I live with my father, Ray Nickel, in that brick bungalow out on Highway number 12. Blue shutters, brown door, one shattered window. Nothing great. The furniture keeps disappearing, though. That keeps things interesting. Half of our family, the better-looking half, is missing. Ray and I get up in the morning and move through our various activities until it's time to go to bed. Every single night around 10 o'clock Ray tells me that he's hitting the hay. Along the way to his bedroom he'll stop in the front halfway and place notes on top of his shoes to remind him of the things he has to do the next day. We enjoy staring at the northern lights together. I told him, verbatim, what Mr. Queering told us in class. About how those lights work. Though Mr. Queering had some interesting points. He's always been mildly interested in Mr. Queering's opinions, probably because he's also a teacher. I have assignments to complete. That's the word, complete. I've got a problem with endings. Mr. Queering has told me that essays and stories generally come, organically, to a preordained ending that is quite out of the writer's control. He says we will know it when it happens, the ending.
I am sitting on the purple velvet settee in the governor's parlor, the governor's wife's parlor. It has always been the governor's wife's parlor, although it is not always the same wife, as they change them around according to the politics. I have my hands folded in my lap the proper way, although I have no gloves. The gloves I would wish to have would be smooth and white, and would be without a wrinkle. I am often in this parlor, clearing away the tea things and dusting the small tables and the long mirror with the frame of grapes and leaves around it and the pianoforte, and the tall clock that came from Europe, with the orange gold sun and the silver moon, that go in and out according to the time of day and the week of the month. I like the clock best of anything in the parlor, although it measures time and I have too much of that on my hands already. But I have never sat down on the settee before, as it is for the guests. Mrs. Alderman Parkinson said a lady must never sit in a chair a gentleman has just vacated, though she would not say why, but Mary Whitney said, because, you silly goose, it's still warm from his bum, which was a coarse thing to say. So I cannot sit here without thinking of the ladylike bums that have sat on this very settee, all delicate and white, like wobbly soft-boiled eggs.
Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops and traversed by a brook that had its source away back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade, but by the time it reached Lynde's Hollow it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avonlea and out of it, who can attend closely to their neighbor's business by dint of neglecting their own, but Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. Yet with all this Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in odd voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. Since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence with water on two sides of it, anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill road and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye.
They're all dead now. Here's a picture of the town where they lived. New Waterford. It's a night bright with the moon. Imagine you are looking down from the height of a church steeple, onto the vivid gradations of light and shadow that make the picture. A small mining town near cutaway cliffs that curve over narrow rock beaches below, where the silver sea rolls and rolls, flattering the moon. Not many trees, thin grass. The silhouette of a colliery, iron tower against a slim pewter sky with cables and supports sloping at 45-degree angles to the ground. Railway tracks that stretch only a short distance from the base of a gorgeous high slant of glinting coal, towards an archway in the earth where the tracks slope in and down and disappear. And spreading away from the collieries and coal heaps are the peaked roofs of the miners' houses built row on row by the coal company. Company houses. Company town. Look down over the street where they lived. Water Street. An avenue of packed dust and scattered stones that leads out past the edge of town to where the wide, heeling graveyard overlooks the ocean. That sighing sound is just the sea.
My lifelong involvement with Mrs. Dempster began at 8:00 p.m. on the 27th of December 1908, at which time I was 10 years and 7 months old. I am able to date the occasion with complete certainty because that afternoon I had been sledding with my lifelong friend and enemy Percy Boyd Staunton, and we had quarreled, because his fine new Christmas sled would not go as fast as my old one. Snow was never heavy in our part of the world, but this Christmas it had been plentiful enough almost to cover the tallest spears of dried grass in the fields. In such snow his sled with its tall runners and foolish steering apparatus was clumsy and apt to stick, whereas my low-slung old affair would almost have slid on grass without snow. The afternoon had been humiliating for him, and when Percy is humiliated he was vindictive. His parents were rich, his clothes were fine, and his mittens were of skin and came from a store in the city, whereas mine were knitted by my mother. It was manifestly wrong, therefore, that his splendid sled should not go faster than mine, and when such injustice showed itself Percy became cranky. He slighted my sled, scoffed at my mittens, and at last came right out and said that his father was better than my father. Instead of hitting him, which might have started a fight that could have ended in a draw or even a defeat for me, I said, all right, then, I would go home and he could have the field to himself.
The coulee is so still right now that if a match were to be lit, the flame would not waver. The tall grasses stand without quivering. The tops flop this way and that. The whole dark sky is bright with stars, and only the new moon moves. We come here once every year around this time, Uncle and I. This spot is half a mile from the Barkers' farm and 7 miles from the village of Granton, where we finally moved in 1951. Nothing changes ni, I say as we walk toward the rise. Umi no yo, Uncle says, pointing to the grass. It's like the sea. The hill surface, as if responding to a command from Uncle's outstretched hand, undulates suddenly in a breeze, with ripple after ripple of grass shadows, rhythmical as ocean waves. We wade through the dry surf, the flecks of grass hitting us like spray. Uncle walks jerkily as a baby on the unsure ground, his feet wide spread, his arms suddenly out like a tightrope walker's when he loses his balance. Dizzy? I ask, grabbing him as he wobbles unsteadily on one leg. His lips make small smacking sounds as he sucks in air. Too much, old man, he says, and totters back upright. When we come to the top of the slope, we find the dip in the ground where he usually rests.
When Duddy Kravitz was a boy of 15 in the middle of the last war, he learned the lesson that took him a long time to unlearn. He was sitting in class, the master was expounding some historical point, and suddenly he heard himself say aloud, to the delight of the boys at his table, "That's a stinkin' lie. My grandfather wasn't a furrier in Russia, he was a pimp in Minsk." The room grew very still. The master, a red-faced Irishman who never forgot an insult, glared at him and said, "I presume, Kravitz, that you have documentary evidence to support your assertion." Duddy had none, but he had been told stories of his grandfather's life in Minsk since he was a child. They were family legends, a part of the Kravitz heritage. "Prove it," the master ordered. "Bring me proof." The other boys, most of whom had also heard the story, were puzzled by his outburst. For Duddy, however, it was a matter of importance. The master's tone had suggested that he had made the whole thing up, and that he was a liar. He was stung by this, and it made him a liar. But he was not going to be caught again. He would not make a statement he couldn't prove. He tried to forget the incident, but the words "bring me proof" stuck in his craw. They made him feel like a defendant. He knew that if he didn't bring in some kind of evidence the next day, he would be laughed at by the whole class.
The labor progressed slowly, but she didn't mind. The day was bright and warm and the room was filled with midwives, each attending to their own task. Elizabeth tried to concentrate on the rhythm of her breathing, but her thoughts kept turning to the baby's father, Charlie Freeman, who had been killed in the mines just a few months earlier. She tried to push the memories away, to focus on the labor, but they kept creeping back. She thought of Charlie's gentle hands and how they used to play over her swollen belly. She thought of his easy smile and the love in his eyes. She thought of the world without him in it and felt an ache in her heart. Elizabeth Bishop was the last of the Annapolis Valley's great birth attendants. With her long gray hair pulled back in a braid, and her white apron over her skirt and blouse, she looked every inch the midwife. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she helped the baby ease its way down. Elizabeth had delivered babies for over 60 years, and had attended more than 2,000 births. She was proud of her work, and knew that the people in Scotts Bay thought of her as a miracle worker.
He was looking from the window of the car all the way. Two adults in the front seat spoke quietly under their breath. He could have listened if he wanted to, but he didn't. For a while, at the section of the road where the river sometimes flooded, he could hear the spray of water at the wheels. They entered the fort and the car slipped silently past the post office building and the clock tower. At this hour of the night there was barely any traffic in Colombo. They drove out along Reclamation Road, past St. Anthony's Church, and after that he saw the last of the food stalls, each lit with a single bulb. Then they entered a vast open space that was the harbor, with only a string of lights in the distance along the pier. He got out and stood by the warmth of the car. He could hear the stray dogs that lived on the quays barking out of the darkness. Nearly everything around him was invisible, save for what could be seen under the spray of a few sulfur lanterns, watersiders pulling a procession of baggage wagons, some families huddled together. They were all beginning to walk towards the ship. He was 11 years old that night when, green as he could be about the world, he climbed aboard the first and only ship of his life. It felt as if a city had been added to the coast, better lit than any town or village. He went up the gangplank, watching only the path of his feet, nothing ahead of him existed, and continued till he faced the dark harbor and sea.
The history of Stonefield is one of an ongoing, and largely unacknowledged, feud between the village and the surrounding country. The village is the chief center of commerce and administration in the district, and the farm people, who are in the majority, resent its power. There are rivalries, jealousies, petty animosities on both sides, but the country people have one weapon of which the villagers are largely ignorant. This is their ability to ridicule, to make a joke, to mock. Often it is an uneasy and painful weapon to use, but it has been developed to a fine point of skill. Morag Gunn was born and reared in Manawaka, Saskatchewan, a small prairie town. Her father was a lawyer and her mother had been a teacher. She was an only child, and her parents were well pleased with her. They had both been born in the country, but they were urban in their sympathies, and particularly their intellectual and artistic interests. Morag, too, was brought up to be an urbanite. They traveled frequently, and she saw most of the great cities of Europe before she was 18. She went to the University of Manitoba, where she took her BA and MA degrees in English literature. It was there that she first began to realize that she was a writer. Her early attempts were full of echoes and derivations, but they were heartfelt.
She stands up in the garden where she has been working and looks into the distance. She has sensed a shift in the weather. There is another gust of wind, a buckle of noise in the air, and the tall cypresses sway. She turns and moves uphill towards the house, climbing over a low wall, feeling the first drops of rain on her bare arms. She crosses the loggia and quickly enters the house. In the kitchen she doesn't pause but goes through it and climbs the stairs which are in darkness and then continues along the long hall, at the end of which is a wedge of light from an open door. She turns into the room which is another garden, this one made up of trees and bowers painted over its walls and ceiling. The man lies on the bed, his body exposed to the breeze, and he turns his head slowly towards her as she enters. Every 4 days she washes his black body, beginning at the destroyed feet. She wets a washcloth and holding it above his ankles squeezes the water onto him, looking up as he murmurs, seeing his smile. Above the shins the burns are worst. Beyond purple. Bone. She has nursed him for months and she knows the body well, the penis sleeping like a seahorse, the thin tight hips. Hip bones of Christ, she thinks. He is her despairing saint. He lies flat on his back, no pillow, looking up at the foliage painted onto the ceiling, its canopy of branches, and above that, blue sky.
We slept in what had once been the gymnasium. The floor was of varnished wood, with stripes and circles painted on it, for the games that were formerly played there. The hoops for the basketball nets were still in place, though the nets were gone. A balcony ran around the room, for the spectators, and I thought I could smell, faintly like an afterimage, the pungent scent of sweat, shot through with the sweet taint of chewing gum and perfume from the watching girls, felt-skirted as I knew from pictures, later in miniskirts, then pants. Then in one earring, spike green streaked hair. Dances would have been held there, the music lingered, a palimpsest of unheard sound, style upon style, an undercurrent of drums, a forlorn wall, garlands made of tissue paper flowers, cardboard devils, a revolving ball of mirrors, powdering the dancers with a snow of light. There was old sex in the room and loneliness, and expectation, of something without a shape or name. I remember that yearning, for something that was always about to happen and was never the same as the hands that were on us there and then, in the small of the back, or out back, in the parking lot, or in the television room with the sound turned down and only the pictures flickering over lifting flesh.
I've been on what people call a tear. So many strange things have happened that I'm tempted to believe, as my father once said, that when you're born the devil says, here's a little jigsaw puzzle of the world and you must solve it before you die, or you'll be doomed to eternal puzzlement. And yet my life has been unremarkable, the youngest of 4 children, daughter of a prosperous merchant, a woman living in the tiny world of an Ontario town, tethered by marriage and motherhood, a woman who will never see Rome. But there's been an accumulating of incident. A few years ago, when I was still in good health, I drove down to the States with a friend, a journey I'd taken before without incident. This time we ran into trouble, first with the border officials. They wouldn't let my friend across, though she'd always had the right to come and go, and nothing had changed. Then we got lost. All the exits and turnoffs seemed to vanish, the map proved worthless, and we drove on into the night, getting hungry and exhausted, the car getting low on gas. As we drove, we passed through strange, almost deserted towns, over hills and valleys, through farmland and forest. We saw some odd things: a rusted pickup truck lying on its side in the ditch, an old bicycle abandoned in a field, but what was really strange was the absence of people. The only signs of life were neon lights, and they were garish and unsettling. We drove for hours without seeing anyone, and when we finally arrived at our destination, a motel, it was as if we'd entered a strange, twilight world.
Somebody's mother, maybe my own, waded into the shallows of Lake Erie and pulled out a stone, a smooth oblong pebble about the size of a peach pit. The next day this stone was wrapped in a bit of the Cleveland plain dealer and brought to me as a toy. It must have been a nifty toy because I played with it for hours, hammering it against the sidewalk, dropping it onto the grass, scouring its surface with the rough cement of our back porch. For all I know, it's still in the bottom of the big crock where my mother kept her preserves. I've got nothing against that stone. But it's not the stone I'm thinking about, it's my mother. When I picture her, it's always that broad-backed woman in the flowered dress who's holding me, my squalling self, against her hip. She's walking around the kitchen or down the hall, into the bedroom. She's got the same expression on her face she'd have if she were standing ankle-deep in the Jordan River, waiting for John the Baptist himself to lean down and bless her hair. She's fierce, this woman, with a directness that scares the life out of lesser people. But she's also tender. She can touch my forehead with the tips of her fingers, her palm hovering over my cheek, and her touch is like a butterfly landing on my face.
Robert Ross, a sensitive 19-year-old Canadian officer, went to war, the war to end all wars. He came home forever changed. This is his story. The sun was risen high in the sky and was hot on Robert's back. He was exhausted, and his head was spinning. He had come to the front almost 5 months earlier and had seen continuous action ever since. The men around him had become his family, they depended on each other for support and strength. But now he was alone, in the open, caught in the midst of the German bombardment. He had lost sight of his company, and he did not know which way to turn. Suddenly, he felt a great heat in his back, and then a pain that ripped through him like a jagged knife. He fell forward onto his face, unconscious. When he awoke, it was dark, and he was lying on his back. He could see nothing. The smell of smoke was overwhelming, and he could hear the sound of distant firing. He tried to move, but the pain was too great. He cried out, and then everything went black again. The next time he awoke, it was daylight. He was lying in a ditch, and there was a dead horse beside him. He could hear the sound of running water and the chirping of birds. He was thirsty and hungry, and he felt a terrible ache in his back. He tried to sit up, but he fell back again, dizzy and weak. He lay there for a long time, wondering if he would ever be able to move again.